Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
This is a Labour government led by working people for working people.
What is the Deputy Prime Minister's definition of working people?
The definition of working people are the people that the Tory party have failed for the last 14 years.
Oliver Dowden.
Well, the Deputy Prime Minister stood on a manifesto promising not to raise taxes on working people. It now appears she can't even define who working people are.
Angela Rayner and Oliver Dowden during last week's Deputy Prime Minister's questions, debating a question that's causing some trouble for the Labour Party. Hello, you're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Stephen Carroll.
And I'm Yuan. Welcome to the programme. Yeah, it's a phrase that Labour used in the election as shorthand for the everyday folk who would not be getting a tax rise, working people. Presumably picked for being suitably vague, but conveying a clear meaning. So far, so good. But the problem for Labour, with a long 4-month window between their election win and a tax-raising budget, is that it has invited endless speculation and questioning from the media. Does it include pensioners or small landlords or anyone who might get some dividends from shares? And what about hedge fund managers famous for working long hours and making oodles of cash? Surely they're working people. It's all proved a bit of a headache for the new government.
And most importantly, dominating the debate up to this momentous budget. The Prime Minister is out today doing his best to try to shift the narrative in a speech where he's talking about embracing the harsh light of fiscal reality. But as former Governor of the Bank of England, Mervyn King, pointed out, it is people that pay the majority of taxes, and he calls this focus on the working people question a terrible illusion by the government. So are they getting it right in how they're framing this budget?
Well, let's discuss all of this with someone who's been involved with some of these discussions in the Labour Party and in government. Sam White was Chief of Staff to Keir Starmer until 2022 and previously a special advisor in the Treasury to Labour Chancellor Alistair Darling, and now a specialist partner at the public affairs firm Flint. Sam, thanks for joining us on the programme. It seems like the government's tied itself in all sorts of knots over this definition of working people. Do you think that this was all foreseeable?
I think it's one of these rows which feels slightly concocted to fill the space a bit between the election and the budget. I can see exactly why Labour is talking about working people. Every government uses some sort of phrase to try and frame the group of people they're talking about. You know, we remember the Blair government loved hardworking families. Theresa May loved just about managing. Nick Clegg loved Wake Up, Alarm Clock Britain, I think he liked. And Ed Miliband liked the squeezed middle. So, there's a phrase used at the sort of highest level of political communication to try and signal we're talking about this group of people, which people can recognise themselves as probably part of that group. But you've got to think about politics and legislation and policy operating at different levels. What we've got here is an attempt to try and say, well, look, that's a high-level political communication tool for a politician, capture a lot in shorthand. Could we make that a definition in tax law or regulation? And of course, it's never going to work for that level of detail. So you're going to have to wait for the budget to see how that translates to, this many pounds, this many pence, which, tax thresholds are affected, blah, blah, blah. You won't be able to derive that just from trying to transpose the high level definition of working people onto tax law.
Is part of the problem here, Sam, that since Labour have been elected, they've been talking endlessly about all of the bad news that's to come in this budget? Is there simply just been too much time before the announcements themselves that have allowed this sort of debate to erupt around the question of how do you define working people?
So I don't think it's been too long. I don't think it's too much of a problem that there's debate about what constitutes working people. I don't really feel that in comparison to many of the other problems at previous fiscal events, that's all that serious. I think Labour's been right to focus on quite how difficult the set of decisions they've got, and also how much this isn't a sort of once and done thing where, you solve it in a single fiscal event. This is a decade of renewal, as they've been describing it, and they're not joking. The inheritance at this change of government is different to the changes of governments in 1997 or 2010. In 97, you obviously had public services in a bad state, but not as bad as now. But you had the economy growing at a lovely clip of 2.5%, 3%, and debt still around 40%, tax is still pretty low. And in 2010, you had a deficit of 10% that whoever won that election was going to have to manage. But the flip side was you had public services at their highest level of public satisfaction, the lowest waiting lists ever, schools, hospitals rebuilt. What you've got this time is both public finances and public services broken at the same time, and sitting on top of an economy which has had no real growth over the last 10, 15 years. Real income's no better than 15 years ago. Productivity flat for at least a decade. Investment flat since Brexit. I think it's a uniquely different set of problems, and the government needs to walk a very thin line between offering some sense of sunlight and hope. Yes, things will get better, but not allowing people to move too quickly off quite how difficult this is, quite how much pain there may be in the short term, and quite how long it's going to take to turn things around.
Isn't it foreseeable, though, given the inheritance you talk about and the need to talk about the difficult inheritance and the inevitable tax raising coming in the budget, isn't it to be expected if you drag it out for 4 months, there's going to be a lot of negative speculation? Wouldn't it have been better to do the budget, in early September or something?
I mean, you could always make a case for doing fiscal events at different times. What I found in sort of political communication is most of the public don't pay very much attention to the degree of political communication that maybe you do on a program like this or people like me do. And it often takes longer for a message to really get through. My favourite fact about the election campaign was Keir Starmer's dad was a toolmaker. You might have heard that. But the total percentage of the population who know that fact, do you know what it is?
No, go on.
It's 11%.
Wow,
so the fact, even though this was banged on about to death by the Labour Party, to the point where it was being parodied and mocked by journalists and commentators, it had reached only 11% of the public. So you've got to really persist with a message and drive it home before it gets fully absorbed. And I still think the biggest danger that this government has to navigate is the rise of populism. Reform had its best, came second in 90 seats and had a very good election. The rise of populism, which says there are easy answers to difficult questions. And this government has to walk that line of saying to people, no, recognise where we're coming from, how difficult this is going to be to turn around. Because if you think this is going to be all over in a few years, you are inevitably going to be disappointed with the government and maybe pull the lever called, populism, easy answers, and facilitate another cycle of decline for Britain, which is the last thing any patriotic person would want to see. So they've got to buy themselves the patience to do, a decade of turnaround. The point that I think they would make is investment, infrastructure, productivity. Those are the things which are going to drive, real growth. But they're not click your fingers. I remember working for Alistair Darling when he was Transport Secretary, and we opened the M6 toll road. And he said, this is a great triumph for the Labour government. Unfortunately, it's the Callaghan government in the 70s, because they're the ones who started this road. And similarly, I remember cutting my teeth on the Crossrail bill in Parliament in 2005, which is now the Elizabeth line, only opened a year or two ago. These things have very slow burn times. The sorts of investments that Labour will be getting going in this budget might not pay off until the 2030s.
Well, how do you sell that then politically? That if there's no argument but that sort of investment is needed. It sounds like we're going to get big investment plans from the Chancellor, but how does she sell it to the public in a way that they'll understand that you won't see benefits in a short term?
This is the key challenge. It's if they are too much gloom, then people say you're starting to affect consumer confidence, appetite for foreign investment. But if they don't land quite how difficult this is and how long it will take, they will be overwhelmed by a sort of populist backlash that they haven't done everything fast enough. So it's a really, really difficult sell. I think what they've tried to do is lean quite heavily into, finding simple ways of bringing to light something like the fiscal black hole with the 22 billion is one way of talking about it. I mean, I've spoken elsewhere about, Rachel Reeves needs to kind of take Britain by the hand and lead it out of the 9 circles of fiscal hell, because I think there's at least 9 different types of problem here that they're trying to navigate. But these are not easy communication tools. So I think you'll see the government kind of move it with occasional show of light and then back to the gloom, bit of show of light, back to the gloom. And they've got to really land the decade of renewal turnaround idea in the public mind, because I think anything less than a decade and you're not going to have made substantive enough progress, because these things take time for the investments to turn into productive growth.
It's a tricky task. Do you think Labour have been taken aback at just how quickly things have started to get rough? Have you been surprised?
I think going into government was always going to be feeling a bit like hit by a freight train for people who haven't done it before, because it is difficult, and the sheer amount of stuff that comes at you. I remember as a very junior special advisor, 20 years ago, thinking it took me 70, 80, sometimes 90 hours of the week just to keep up with what was happening in the department, all the decisions that needed taking by the ministers, the briefings, the appearances, the parliamentary staff, the parliamentary questions, the freedom of information requests, managing all of that stuff. And you only got to do your sort of proactive front foot stuff in the last sort of 10 hours of the week. But that meant if you did anything less than 100 hours, forget it. You weren't going to make much impact. And that's tough. I think they were reasonably well prepared in so far as many more of these cabinet members had actually held positions in government, either as junior ministers or some of them as special advisors, like people like Peter Kyle, the Science Secretary of State, had been a long-term political advisor. Same with Ed Miliband. Of course, Ed had also been Climate Secretary, same job 15 years ago. So they had a little bit more experience than I think people thought about them. Certainly a lot more experience than, say, the 1997 cabinet had of governing. I think they are navigating how to operate the government machine. Keir's quite keen to use the idea of missions to frame delivery and frame cross-governmental working that breaks down the silos. Now, that's hard, and Whitehall has a gravity that pulls against that. So that's going to mean persistent effort by the Prime Minister at prime ministerial level to signal to Whitehall, no, I mean it. These missions are what is going to drive my government and which we're going to measure success. And we are going to break down the natural sort of inertia between departments. And I think number 10 is taking a little while to find its feet. I think, even their closest friends would say, it's not gone exactly according to plan. Obviously, Keir's changed his chief of staff again a couple of weeks back, and they seem to be rebuilding operation at the moment. But I think from my conversations with people there that they've got that half the job is clarity of role and personnel, but half the job is fixing the culture. Because if you've got a culture that's dysfunctional, that's going to be a massive drag on trying to deliver.
Okay, well, we'll watch to see how this plays out. Sam White, former Chief of Staff to Keir Starmer and previously a Special Advisor as well, now with Flint. Thank you very much for joining us on the programme today. That's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe, give it 5 stars so other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by Tiwa Adebayo and our audio engineer was Sean Guastamakia. I'm Yuan Potts.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. We'll be back with more tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.